August 19th, 1944. Inside Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl bent over fresh intelligence from France and saw what looked like an American disaster disguised as a triumph. Patton's Third Army had surged roughly 400 miles in about 30 days. Spearhead divisions were sprinting toward Germany itself, but to Jodl and his operations staff, the story wasn't speed. It was weight. Momentum had a price, and the Americans, he believed, had already spent it. The Americans have outrun their logistics, Jodl told the room. An advance like this, he argued, could only end one way. Not with a heroic last stand, but with engines starving, tracks grinding to silence, and an army trapped by the friction of its own success. No force in history, he insisted, had kept that tempo without fuel and parts, not because of courage, but because physics always won. The laws of war, in Jodl's mind, were mathematical. His staff had numbers ready. An armored division, when pushing forward, could drink about 150,000 gallons of fuel per day. Patton had a dozen divisions spread across a 60-mile front. Meanwhile, the supply depots sat far behind, back at the Normandy beaches, roughly 400 miles to the rear. The French road network had been battered, bridges blown, rail lines wrecked in the German retreat. Jodl's conclusion felt clean and final. Patton needed around 12,000 tons of supplies each day, and France couldn't carry that much freight at that speed. Third Army would choke somewhere around the Seine. The pause would hand Germany time to regroup, to dig in, maybe even to hold through winter. The arithmetic, to German eyes, was unbreakable. What Jodl didn't know was that the Americans had already decided to break it anyway. Even as German staff officers congratulated themselves on their logic, American logistics planners were sketching something that ignored every rule the E-by-do Germans believed made modern warfare possible. A continuous convoy system, an improvised, relentless one-way river of trucks, was being built fast enough to look like magic from the other side. An operation so audacious that it would be up and running within days. And on August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express would roll. The confidence inside the German high command came from experience that had been paid for in blood. The Germans had pioneered blitzkrieg and knew intimately what killed an offensive once the first burst of speed faded. Their own campaigns had stalled again and again, not because soldiers lost their nerve, but because supply lines snapped. In the east, the Wehrmacht's early gains had collapsed under distance and breakdowns. Trucks died on brutal roads. Horses, still the backbone of German transport, could not keep up with panzers. Rail gauges didn't match. Supplies piled up far from the front, and entire formations sat motionless, waiting for fuel that never arrived. German officers carried that lesson like a scar. Machinery gave you reach, but it also chained you to gasoline, ammunition, spare parts, and tires. Commanders like General Heinrich von Luttwitz, leading armored formations, looked at the Americans and saw the same trap closing. Mechanical advantage, he believed, would become mechanical vulnerability. German intelligence tracked consumption rates with the seriousness of a surgeon. A Sherman tank, they calculated, burned fuel at a vicious rate, on roads worse than expected, and even worse cross-country. Infantry divisions needed hundreds of tons daily. Armored divisions closer to 1,000. On August 20th, 1944, senior German staff assessments described the enemy supply situation as essentially impossible. They waited for the halt the way a hunter waits for an exhausted animal to stumble. And then, the halt never came. August 25th, 1944. In a requisitioned French chateau near Laval, Colonel Charles Thrasher faced skeptical officers and laid out a plan that sounded insane precisely because it was simple. The traditional system was cracking. Rail couldn't keep pace. Scheduled convoys were backing up. Depots were clogged. The standard rhythm of supply was failing, while Patton's appetite only grew. Thrasher said they would stop pretending the old methods could catch up. They would create a one-way highway from the beaches to the front. 2 parallel routes, one for loaded trucks moving forward, one for empties returning. 20 hours of movement out of every 24. No stopping except for fuel, breakdowns, or emergencies. A minimum goal of about 4,500 tons per day, just to keep Third Army alive. The details were even more shocking. Headlights blazing all night, abandoning blackout discipline completely. Convoys moving in tight intervals, minutes apart, holding roughly 35 miles per hour as an average speed. Mobile maintenance teams stationed about every 50 miles. Military police checkpoints empowered to strip the road of anything that couldn't keep up. Any vehicle under a minimum speed would be treated as a threat to the entire system. If a truck couldn't be fixed fast, 15 minutes, then it wasn't repaired. It was pushed off the road, abandoned, cannibalized. The route itself would not be allowed to slow down for any individual machine. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Ainsley of Motor Transport reviewed requirements, and the numbers sounded like a dare to reality. About 140 truck companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles, and availability that would need to hover around 90%. No textbook would sign its name to that prediction. Yet within roughly 36 hours, the impossible was operational. The name came from railway language. A red ball freight shipment meant express priority. Everything else moved aside. This would be the same idea, except the freight would be the lifeblood of an advancing army, and the rail would be the battered roads of France. On August 26, 1944, drivers from units like the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into GMC CCKW trucks. The Deuce and a Half, loaded with ammunition, headed east. Over time, about 23,000 men would drive the Red Ball Express, and roughly 3/4 of them were African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army. Many of them came from a country that still denied them basic dignity in civilian life. Yet, here they were, keeping the most famous white general's army moving. The irony wasn't subtle. They hauled the tools of liberation across France, while still waiting to fully hold that freedom at home. Every mile was a silent argument about citizenship. A culture formed almost instantly. Slogans appeared on truck doors like battle flags. Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come. Detroit to Berlin Express. The trucks became identity, pride, and pressure. The rules of the road became harsh and brutally practical. Slow vehicles pulled off immediately. Failures were shoved into ditches without ceremony. Anything that couldn't maintain pace was a roadblock, and roadblocks were enemies. Crews ran in punishing shifts, 20 hours driving, 4 hours of sleep, fueling themselves with coffee, grit, and, sometimes, military-issued stimulants just to keep their eyes open. In less than 2 days, they built a rhythm that would last for 82 days without pause. And German intelligence was about to start receiving reports that sounded like hallucinations. By August 28, 1944, German reconnaissance units watching the main Red Ball route began reporting something they could barely describe without sounding incompetent. A continuous column of vehicles with headlights visible for kilometers. No spacing, no concealment, no blackout. Some observers estimated 1,000 vehicles an hour passing their positions. To German soldiers crouched in dark foxholes, the sound wasn't merely traffic. It was vibration, endless and steady, like the heartbeat of an industrial creature that did not sleep and did not care if they did. On August 30th, 1944, General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the phenomenon. What he saw matched what frontline troops were whispering about. In his report upward, he noted something close to disbelief. Vehicles passing at intervals so tight, half a minute, sometimes less, day and night, without dispersal, without hiding, without anything that resembled German procedure. It wasn't just the volume, it was the attitude. The Americans were not acting like an army guarding a fragile supply line. They were acting like a factory line that simply extended across France. What the Germans struggled to understand was that American logistics rested on different assumptions. German doctrine emphasized concealment and preservation. American planners accepted waste as the cost of speed. German systems were rigid: procedure, authorization, scheduling. The American system was improvisational, individual drivers and unit leaders making fast decisions that, in the Wehrmacht, would require signatures and meetings. German officers saw disorder. The Americans called it momentum. The results arrived quickly enough to embarrass every German calculation. In the first week, August 25th through August 31st, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered roughly 89,939 tons of supplies. Each round trip covered hundreds of miles. Headquarters had set an initial goal near 4,500 tons daily. The convoys delivered nearly triple that. Patton's Third Army did not slow due to lack of supplies. The tanks that were supposed to be immobilized kept pushing. By September 5th, 1944, cumulative tonnage climbed to around 135,000 tons delivered. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, moved more supplies than German forces in France were receiving through their rail system. German intelligence officers stared at the numbers like they were errors. Vehicle availability averaged above 90%, when the sensible prediction had been much lower. Maintenance crews performed near constant triage, swapping engines with mobile cranes, stripping broken vehicles for parts, keeping a fleet alive that should have collapsed under its own strain. German reports from the front shifted tone. Third Army had crossed key lines at the exact moment German staff officers insisted it would run dry. Instead of pausing, it accelerated. Cities expected to hold became names on a list of places already lost. Bridgeheads were seized, defenses bypassed or shattered, before they were even finished. The inevitable stall never arrived. The Red Ball Express was sustaining an advance that German military science had declared physically impossible. But to understand how an impossible machine was built so fast, you had to look backward. Past France, past Normandy, past the summer of 1944, to a mind that had been obsessed with this problem since the last war. The Germans had misjudged who shaped American logistics at the highest level. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was not only a strategist, he was one of the most formidable logistical thinkers the United States ever produced. His experience had been forged during the First World War. As a staff officer, Marshall helped coordinate enormous troop and supply movements for the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918, shifting hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of horses under pressure, under secrecy, under time. He learned that victory could be built by flow, continuous movement, redundancy, and the willingness to accept inefficiency if it preserved tempo. Those ideas hardened into doctrine. In the 1930s, at places like Fort Benning, Marshall pushed modernization and watched officers closely. keeping mental notes of who could think clearly under strain. On September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, Marshall became Chief of Staff. At that time, Eisenhower was still only a lieutenant colonel, yet Marshall already had him marked as high command material. In the years before America entered the war, Marshall reshaped the senior leadership of the Army, forcing out officers he considered outdated and elevating those with the mentality required for modern industrial war. Patton, Eisenhower, and so many others moved through a system Marshall had engineered to produce commanders who understood that speed, coordination, and supply would decide everything. The Red Ball Express was not an accident. It was the logical expression of Marshall's worldview, executed by the men he had trained, selected, and pushed forward. On the ground in Europe, the key organizer was General John C.H. Lee, the quartermaster chief for the theater, nicknamed, by soldiers, Jesus Christ himself, Lee. Not as praise, but as a jab at his swagger and his religious intensity. Lee was arrogant, abrasive, and famously indifferent to whether anyone liked him. He moved his headquarters into luxury hotels while combat troops slept in mud. Patton and Eisenhower clashed with him. Officers rolled their eyes at him. Enlisted men resented him. Yet Lee made supplies move. He had spent a career in logistics and believed the core truth of war was simple. Battles were theater. Tonnage was reality. You could win a fight and still lose a campaign if fuel failed to arrive. Lee cared about tons per mile per day. When Patton demanded fuel, Lee found fuel. When ammunition ran low, Lee prioritized ammunition. When winter clothing became a crisis, Lee pushed winter clothing forward. His staff worked around the clock, positioning dumps ahead of Third Army, staging supplies at crossroads Patton would reach in days, anticipating needs before commanders even asked. The Red Ball Express became Lee's masterpiece. Wasteful, brutal on machines, brutal on men, and relentlessly effective. Every 50 miles, mobile maintenance units worked like emergency surgeons. Engines were swapped in under an hour. Recovery teams descended on breakdowns immediately. The Laval rules were absolute: repair fast or remove the vehicle from the artery. If the truck couldn't return to motion quickly, it was stripped of usable parts and shoved aside. For many drivers, the truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was their shelter, their routine, their identity. But the Red Ball Express had no room for sentiment, only the cold arithmetic of keeping the flow alive. Winter approached and tried to break the system the way Jodl expected physics to break it. Freezing rain and snow turned engines stubborn. Batteries died. Roads chewed up tires. Loads ran heavy. Speeds stayed high. Drivers improvised constantly, draining warm oil and reheating it over fires to restart engines, wrapping batteries, rotating parts through heated tents, mixing alcohol into fuel to fight freezing. Tires failed in staggering numbers. Rough roads, overweight cargo, relentless tempo. The operation burned through something like 180,000 tires in about 82 days, with replacement piles staged along the routes like ammunition stockpiles. Drivers became mechanics because they had to be. They learned by sound, by vibration, by failure. They carried toolkits as naturally as a rifleman carried a weapon. The trucks themselves, reliable, sturdy, but not magical, were not the miracle. The miracle was keeping thousands of them operational simultaneously for nearly 3 months under conditions that should have collapsed any fleet. German soldiers in defensive positions began to dread the night. In the darkness, the American convoys sounded louder and closer, a constant rumble that never stopped. Veterans later described the psychological weight. They could hear the traffic from kilometers away, every night, unbroken. It told them what was coming: more shells, more fuel, more food, more replacements. Captured soldiers reported they could sometimes predict American offensives by listening. When the traffic swelled, an attack followed. But knowing didn't help. They couldn't halt a supply line that did not behave like a single line. They shelled routes, destroyed trucks, and watched as the Americans simply shoved wrecks aside and kept moving. One destroyed vehicle meant nothing when thousands more followed. Air attacks were rare and costly for Germany. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, faced Allied air superiority. American fighters patrolled key routes. German planes that tried to strafe convoys often did not return. The Red Ball Express, in effect, operated under a protective dome of American air power while daring the Germans to stop an industrial flood with a handful of stones. By September of 1944, Third Army crossed the Seine at the very moment German calculations said it would be empty. Instead of slowing, it pushed harder. Patton crossed the Moselle River by September 5, 1944. Defensive lines the Germans tried to build were cracked before they could harden. The Wehrmacht was retreating so fast it couldn't even destroy infrastructure thoroughly. Patton exploited the chaos, racing toward the border. In a matter of weeks, Third Army had surged hundreds of miles from Normandy to the edge of Germany. British and Canadian forces advanced more cautiously in the north. Patton moved like lightning because his supply system made lightning sustainable. The Germans' logistical prediction wasn't merely wrong, it was wrong by months. The Red Ball Express did not fail due to exhaustion. Patton's eventual slowdown came from strategic decisions above him and from stiffening resistance. Fuel priorities shifted, operations competed, enemy defenses thickened at rivers and the West Wall. But during the Red Ball period, Third Army did not stop for lack of supplies. The trucks kept rolling. The Army kept advancing. That victory carried a brutal price. By conservative measures, thousands of trucks were destroyed, abandoned, or worn out over the 82 days. Millions of gallons of fuel were consumed, and much of that fuel was burned hauling fuel itself. Accountants saw waste, commanders saw speed, and enemy divisions broken. Tire losses alone were staggering. Rubber left scattered across France like a trail of exhausted feet. Drivers suffered casualty rates comparable to some combat units. Accidents born of exhaustion. Enemy artillery on exposed routes. Mechanical failures that turned a simple run into a fatal moment. 20-hour shifts weren't exceptional. They were routine. Stimulants were common. Sleep deprivation became the background of life. Maintenance crews worked until they dropped. The entire machine ran on willpower as much as planning. By November, as rail lines were partially restored, the emergency system could finally be shut down. The Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944. And just as astonishing as its creation was its disappearance. In about 72 hours, the massive operation dissolved. The men were reassigned. The vehicles were redistributed. Routes returned to civilian use. The river of headlights went dark. Final statistics told the story in numbers that sounded like a campaign all by themselves. Roughly 412,193 tons of cargo delivered, about 122 million ton-miles covered, 82 operating days. It was a demonstration that warfare had shifted. Industrial capacity and the ability to move that capacity forward mattered as much as tactical brilliance, sometimes more. Logistics did not simply support strategy. It shaped what strategy could even be. German commanders eventually put the lesson into blunt words. Field Marshal Walter Model, facing Patton, understood by autumn that he wasn't fighting only an American army. He was fighting American industrial power. German units could fight brilliantly with dwindling resources. American units could fight adequately with seemingly unlimited supplies. Model knew which side won that equation. Other German leaders later admitted what surprised them most was not the tanks or the planes, but the trucks, the endless, unglamorous vehicles that turned American production into American pressure at the front. The Red Ball Express proved that the German staff had accounted for almost everything, except the American willingness to accept waste, improvise at scale, and keep the pie flow moving no matter what it cost in rubber, metal, and human endurance. It also proved something quieter and harder to ignore, that thousands of African-American drivers working inside an unjust system had carried a decisive share of the war on their backs and on their sleepless hands. In his memoirs, Patton wrote that those drivers deserved as much credit as combat units. The men who hauled fuel and shells through darkness helped defeat Germany as surely as any rifleman. Decades later, the story still carried weight. In 1994, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the operation, and veterans gathered to remember what they had done, how a supply crisis was beaten not by theory, but by motion. The highways of France still bore scars from those endless convoys. Yet the true monument was the time they bought. Every day shortened, saved lives. Back in East Prussia, on August 19, 1944, Jodl believed he was reading the future in a ledger. He believed he had found the limit line where Patton would stop because he had found the point where numbers refused to cooperate. The truth was harsher for Germany. The Americans had built a system where the numbers did cooperate, because the Americans changed the rules the numbers lived under. The Red Ball Express was not merely a supply route, it was a weapon. And against that weapon, the Wehrmacht had no defense.